Today's scripture is Joshua chapter 6, verses 1 through 7. Now Jericho was shut up inside and out because of the Israelites. No one came out and no one went in. The Lord said to Joshua, "See, I have handed Jericho over to you, along with its king and soldiers. You shall march around the city, all the warriors circling the city at once. Thus you shall do for 6 days, with 7 priests bearing 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark. On the 7th day you shall march around the city 7 times, the priests blowing the trumpets. When they make a long blast with the ram's horn, as soon as you hear the sound of the trumpet, then all the people shall shout with a great shout, and the wall of the city will fall down flat, and all of the people shall charge straight ahead." So Joshua, son of Nun, summoned the priests and said to them, "Take up the ark of the covenant, and have 7 priests carry 7 trumpets of ram's horns in front of the ark of the Lord." To the people he said, "Go forward and march around the city. Have the armed men pass on before the ark of the Lord." This is the word of the Lord.
Yesterday, I got to help play taxi to the mission team along with Dan Jordan. Thank you, Dan. Appreciate it. I'm sure 11 teenagers in your car was super fun. I know. But as I was going there, I was driving alongside Mike. It was his car. So Mike Knowlton, who's the husband of our youth director, Becca, who usually sits in the 3rd row up over here. And we were chatting on the way there, and he was telling me about work. And one of the things that Mike has to do a lot is he has to travel for work. He's usually gone during the week, most weeks, as he goes around to the different facilities that he's in charge of. And he was telling me a story about this last week and some flights that got messed up because there was a plane that was broken and wasn't working, and they, had to change this flight to that flight, and then he was going to miss the meeting and all that sort of thing. And I became really, really grateful in that moment that is no longer part of my life. When I was first out of college in corporate America, I used to travel all the time. I'd leave Sunday night, I'd get home Thursday night, and this was my routine for several years. And I lived in airports, and that is not a fun place to live. And as I was Mike was talking about all his trials and tribulations, I was thinking about this sermon and realizing that my least favorite travel adventure, my least favorite thing that could happen was always at the end of the flight when you think you're getting ready to land and the pilot comes over the intercom and says, "I'm sorry, we're going to have to circle the airfield for a little while." There, for whatever reason, is just no feeling worse than knowing that the place that you're trying to get to is right down there, and for some reason, you're not allowed to go there yet. Dan knows all the reasons as a retired pilot why that happens, and I'm sure they're valid, and there's like safety, and there's reasons like why we are not allowed to land at that moment. The worst is, though, when they're like, "I'm sorry, we've arrived too early, and we don't have a landing slot, so we're going to have to circle the airfield for a while." And at the end of the day, it's the same amount of flying, and you are still going to arrive more or less on time. So you're not really out anything, but there's just something about that act of circling, of waiting, of being in a holding pattern that just does not feel good. And part of the reason why it doesn't feel good, I think, for those of us who are in the back of the plane, is there is some reason why you can't land yet. There is something happening to help it get to the point where you can, but you can't see it. The progress, whatever work is happening to get you where you want to go, is hidden from you in that moment. Right? And so all you are experiencing is sitting in a seat that's rather uncomfortable, circling endlessly, or what feels like endlessly, hoping that the next announcement is going to be, we're buckling our seatbelts and we're going to land. Now, if you haven't had that experience in an airplane, good for you. But my guess are we all can have experiences like that, where we feel like, for whatever reason, our life or whatever we're doing at that moment is just some endless loop where we seem to be doing the same thing over and over again and not really getting anywhere. It would be forgiven for God's people to feel that way about what's going on right now. So if we need to locate ourselves in the story, so we've kind of left behind the first 5 books of the Bible, right? And so last week we talked about the disciples at the very beginning, or not the disciples, but God's people right at the beginning of their journey into the desert, right? So they just freed themselves or been freed by God from slavery, and they're at the mountain, and what they don't know is that it's not going to be a quick trip for them from where they are to the promised land that they're intending to go to. It in fact takes 40 years. So Exodus through Deuteronomy is the story of that 40 years journey that should not take anywhere near 40 years, even given the transportation technology of the time. And so when we catch them here at the beginning of Joshua, they have finally crossed the river. Now, in Jewish tradition especially, the first 5 books are called the Pentateuch, and they are kind of the key books. So that's Genesis through Deuteronomy. What's interesting is at the end of Deuteronomy, they don't actually get there. The end of Deuteronomy, the end of book 5, ends with them standing at the river, Jordan, getting ready to cross into the promised land. And at that point, Moses has actually passed away, and leadership has fallen to a man named Joshua. And so we picked up the action in Joshua chapter 6, or in the book of Joshua, where they do finally get to go where they need to go. And the first major obstacle that they encounter, the first test that they are given of any real size and import, is the city of Jericho, because it is right there next to the river that they just crossed. And so this is really their first task in being able to actually live in the land that God promised them. And I find it really interesting that God's response and God's way of dealing with the city that they now need to deal with is to take people who most of whom have literally spent their entire lives wandering in circles in the desert, 40 years in the desert, and say, okay, what I'm going to want you to do now is circle this city a few more times. Now, we're not really told how people responded to this. I mean, maybe they were just excited to go. And I often wonder, like on day 1 of circling the city, and it's probably a pretty big city, it took most of the day. And so day 1 of circle the city was probably felt pretty good. I do really wonder what they felt like around day 4 and 5, right? Did they wonder if like God was like punking them? Because I would wonder that at that point. You're just like, didn't we just do all the wandering, all the circling, all the stuff? Why are we doing this now? Can't we just blow the trumpets now? And of course, there's significance, and there's often significance, especially in the Old Testament, to the number 7. This was 7 days in a week. It's the idea of completeness, and there's all these kind of like scholarly theological reasons why we put on it. But for me, if I'm an average person who's just blowing a trumpet or walking around, it feels a little arbitrary to be asked to circle the city 7 times over 7 days before God does what God's already told them that he's going to do. But for some reason that we are not told, this is part of the process. Human beings are interesting because I think most of us have the same response to circling if it means that it feels like we're not making progress, and yet we seem to do it by nature. Anytime you hear stories about people who are lost in the desert or lost in the woods, or whatever, it'll usually include some kind of story about how those poor people found themselves simply walking in circles and they didn't even know it. Like, how many stories have we heard about people getting lost in the desert or other sorts of places, and it turns out that they're walking in circles? It's a trope on TV shows, right? They come back and I'm like, wait, I've seen this tree before. We've been walking in circles. And somewhere about in the early 20th century, somebody decided to ask the question is, do people just naturally do this? Is this just something that we do by nature, or is there just something wrong with all those people who got lost? Because the idea, the connotation is that those poor people who got lost, they didn't know what they're doing, and the idea is the rest of us would be better. The rest of us would know to either stay put or be able to walk in a straight line. So in the early 20th century, they did some experiments to see if this was true and what people naturally did. And one guy decided to get a friend, and he got a friend, and he blindfolded the friend, and he put him in a field, just a big flat field in the middle of, I think it was like Nebraska, and basically said, all I want you to do is walk forward. And while he was doing this, walking forward, he traced the path that the guy walked. And I think we have that. I think that's the next picture. So that's the path the guy walked. And he started off okay, and then started to veer slightly, obviously, to the right, and then began to walk actually closer, smaller and smaller, spiraling circles, until he ran into that stump at the bottom there, nearly back at where he started. All the while, the man who was walking was absolutely convinced that he was walking in a straight line. And so they've done this experiment now several times, and they typically get the same results over and over again. And they've tested it different ways. They dropped a guy in the middle of a lake and said, swim straight forward, and he swam in ever smaller circles. And then this next one, they put a guy in a car in the middle of a field with no discernible landmarks, and asked him to drive in a straight line, thinking maybe the theory has always been like, well, maybe you have one leg longer than the other, right? No, that's legitimately how they would explain this. And so they wanted to eliminate all of that. So they're like, well, let's just put him in a car and make him drive in this big, giant, flat thing and see what happens. And this is, of course, what happened. He drove in circles one way and then apparently got bored at one point, decided to drive in circles the other way, until I think literally ran out of gas. For whatever reason, we do this. And about 15 years ago, a German science reality TV show decided to test this one more time, and they dropped people in the desert, and then they dropped people in a forest, and tagged them with GPS, and they weren't blindfolded or anything, in a forest and GPS, and then said, go and walk in a straight line. The people in blue that you can see obviously fell victim to the same thing that everybody else seems to fall victim to, and found themselves not being able to walk in a straight line. And yet, there's the person also marked in yellow. They're in the same place. They were dropped off at mostly the same place in mostly the same environment, and they were allowed to sort of pick which direction they wanted to go. But there really isn't any difference between, in this picture, walking west and walking east as far as the terrain. There is only one difference in these two. The people in blue, on those days, it was cloudy, and you couldn't see the sun. And the person in yellow, it was a bright sunny day, and he could. That was the only difference. If you take the blindfold off the person, they can walk through the field in mostly a straight line, or drive through the field in mostly the straight line. If you have some sort of reference, some sort of landmark that you are walking towards, by, around, away from, whatever it is, we can, as people, navigate more or less straight. If there's a mountain that in your view, if you can see the sun or the moon or anything like that, suddenly we're the person on the yellow line and we can complete the task. When we don't have a point of reference, when we don't know what's going, we don't have anything to orient ourselves to, we tend to walk in ever smaller circles. All human beings that they have tested, nearly all human beings that they have tested, have exhibited the same behavior no matter where they're from, what race they are, what gender they are, no matter what. It seems to be something very unique to us. And for those of us in the Mountain West who live in this part of the world, instinctively already know that this is true, right? Because what direction are the mountains from here? West. And as long as you know where the mountains are, you know what west is, and you can figure all the rest of it out. The mountains in Albuquerque, by the way, are to the east. So as long as you know that, you can figure everything out. Billings, Montana is in a valley, and you can't see the mountains, but you can see the rims, and those are north. And as long as you can see them, you know where you are, and you can navigate. When you get to places, god-awful, terrible places, where there are no visible landmarks, that's when I get in trouble and start to get lost. We need, as people, a point of reference. We need something that we are pointing ourselves to, or something we are pointing ourselves away from. God's people in the story of Jericho are no longer wandering in the desert. They are no longer aimlessly moving from place to place. Yes, they're walking in circles, but their circles have a purpose, even though they don't know what it is. And while they may be frustrated, and it would be fair if they were frustrated for being asked to do something that feels a little random, they do have the benefit of knowing, at least to some degree, where they're going and what's going to happen when they get there, even if what they are doing is walking around over and over and over again. In our lives, we need something to reference our lives to. We live in a world that simply has too many opportunities, too many things to do, too many places to go, too many things to see, to ever think that we're ever going to be able to figure out exactly where we're supposed to go, unless we know where it is that we want to go. Last week we talked and read the letter about our own John being called into ministry as a pastor. And it's always fun for me to talk to clergy or people who are on the beginning of their journey to becoming clergy. And some of the early questions I always ask when I'm asked to do this, after I try to talk them out of it, I always try to talk them out of it. I'm not very successful. Is to basically ask them, why do you want to do this? And that, for me, is the most important question anybody can have. And I think it's the most important question you can have in not only in becoming a clergy, but in many things in life, is knowing, why do you want to do this? And if why you want to do this, and I went to seminary, people who were like this, if why you want to do this and why you want to be a pastor is because you want to be in charge, I'm going to tell you that's probably not the best reason. If you have a purpose other than wanting to help people grow in their discipleship, help people grow in their love of God, neighbor, and self, if you have a purpose other than that, this job is going to be really frustrating for you. In the same way, I think when I talk to teachers and why people want to become teachers or people want to become doctors or lawyers, if your goal in becoming a lawyer is to get a really, really big paycheck, you can do that. I wonder what kind of person you will be at the end of that journey. Is that the best reason for doing so? I think we in our lives need that point of reference that we are always trying to move towards. I think we as a church always need that question of what it is we want to move towards. As a group of people who is willing and able to serve, there is no end of things that we could do. There's no end of ways that we could involve ourselves in the community or involve ourselves in the world at large. Opportunities come at us all the time. If you think you get a lot of junk mail at home, you got nothing on what shows up at a church. Everybody wants to sell us stuff. Everybody wants us to care about what they care about. Everybody wants us to be involved in whatever good work they are doing. And oftentimes, yes, that work is good. So how do we figure out where we invest our time and our energy, which is limited? Well, first and foremost, we need to know who we are. And we have to ask ourselves some pretty basic questions. Is this thing that we want to do going to help us love God, love our neighbor, and love ourselves more? If it's not, then it's probably not something that's for us, even if it is a good thing. I have my own kind of whys that I hold on to, my own kind of things that I try to evaluate decisions against. Some have to do with my faith, some have to do with my family, some have to do with my beliefs about the world and how things should be. Because again, I, like you, have no ends of opportunities to spend my time and my money and my energy. God's people are not walking in vain, even though they're walking in circles. And what makes them not walking in vain is they are following, and they are following God, and they are following where God has asked them to go, even if at the moment it probably doesn't make the most sense to them. Being able to do that is important to any person's life or any group of people's life of faith. We have to ask ourselves every once in a while, what is our why? Where are we trying to go? What kind of life are we trying to lead? How are we endeavoring to love God and love neighbor and love ourselves the way that all God's children are asked to? What is uniquely ours, which might be different than our neighbors? If we do that, if we can figure out what direction we ought be facing and how it is, what we are going to continually look at and keep our gaze on while we go there, we can avoid the walking in ever smaller circles, making our lives ever smaller, and can actually get to the place God wants us to go. Amen.